Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the line. We are recording this podcast on October 4th. My God, is it already that late in the year? We are going to talk about continued and ongoing chaos in Parliament. We're going to talk about CBC mandate review, potentially. Matt's going to ramble on about the state of the zeitgeist. And then we're going to talk about chemtrails in Alberta. Hope you stick with us. Click with us through after the break, and thank you for listening to The Line Podcast with Matt Gurney and Jen Gerson. This episode of The Line has been brought to you by Unsmoke Canada. Canada can be a global leader in reducing the harm caused by smoking, but it requires actionable steps, including giving adult smokers the information they need to choose potentially less harmful alternatives. Learn more at unsmoke.ca.
Want to know how weird things are?
I definitely want to know how weird things are.
We're not even going to talk about ballistic missiles flying all over the Middle East, except for this reference.
Yeah, we have more to talk about. We have so much on our plate. We really do. I
was saying to someone, a hockey dad, a couple weeks ago, where he just kind of made some offhand comment of, you've probably heard versions of this, boy, a lot happening out there, right? It's like, you had no problem finding things to write about. That kind of makes me want to cry, because I remember entire parts of my career where, like, me and the then National Post editorial board would be sitting around in our cubicle barn going like, I don't know what we're going to write about.
I guess we're writing about Rush again today, man.
Yeah, or like we used to joke, like, does the Senate have a supply management hearing going on that we can grab like some couple of quotes? Or, did the Montreal Gazette write anything interesting, or the Ottawa Citizen? We can riff off of that. Like, there would be entire days where we were, I don't know what we're going to talk about today. And then what actually ends up happening now is that there are stories that would have led the news for weeks 5 years ago that get like mentioned once and then forgotten. Donald Trump was almost killed twice this summer.
Oh, right.
Joe Biden seems to be struggling a bit. Russia invaded Europe.
Right.
Iran's firing ballistic missiles over like their own personal 4th of July. And we're just going to motor right past that.
Yeah, we have domestic news to get into, really important stuff. Firstly, before we really do get into it, I am going to ask for our YouTube listeners' advice. Hair up, good, bad, I don't know. Is this color working for me? I will take your commentary on my appearance in this podcast because I'm trying to, look all right. Trying to look all right again. But firstly,
you had that 90s librarian thing going on a few weeks ago, and I was definitely giving you big praise for that, and you were accepting the praise, but now you've gone a totally different direction. Yeah,
I'm a constantly evolving creature. I'm fine with that. But first, let's get into what's going on in Parliament. Matt, can you explain what's happened this week in Parliament before I start going into a full-on rant about the demographic crisis in the country? That is coming, by the way. Okay, so all right. Let's celebrate.
Is it not that I can't? It's just that I think about what's happened this week, and I just feel my feelings.
Okay,
it's really depressing what's happening in Parliament, because nominally these are intelligent, mature individuals, like our thought leaders, the guardians of our democracy, the guarantors of a prosperous future for tens of millions of Canadians for generations to come. And I look at these guys and I'm thinking, the old joke, like, oh, the voters, like, they need to pick who's the smart leader, not the one they want to have a beer with. Parliament of Canada, with notable exceptions, I don't want to have a beer with you. I don't want to have a beer with you. If you're at a bar, if the entire Parliament of Canada is at a bar and I wander in, I'm finding the booth in the corner, or I'm leaving. None of you are impressing me these days, except for my friends who are going to give me bullshit in my text messages. I love you guys. You're great. The rest of y'all.
I have a totally different take. I'm extraordinarily entertained by the chaos.
I know, but you're broken that way. I'm the guy who gets upset by stuff. You're the one who goes like, this is great.
This is very entertaining. I have lots of things to write about. So
Huge mushroom cloud
okay.
floating stuff, and Jen's like, "Wee!"
That's true. Okay, so let's go back a couple of steps here. One is that what's happening in Parliament is essentially a continuation of what we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks in this podcast.
It's third or fourth week of this.
It's the third or fourth week of this. There's massive dysfunction. There's massive chaos. Everyone is incentivized to get nothing done and to maximize the theatrics of the moment. Like, that is where everyone's incentives align right now. So we've had a second confidence motion, which the government's managed to sail through with the support of the NDP and the Bloc. This isn't surprising. We will have several more confidence motions and also a confidence motion on a supply and management motion as well in the next couple of weeks. Every successive confidence motion increases the odds of chaos and crazy. It increases the odds of some number of MPs from some collection of parties just saying fuck it o'clock and we're going to go to an election because we can't continue to do this anymore. It's clear that the psychological pressure on everyone involved here is high and building. Mm-hmm. And in the midst of all of this, you've got the Bloc saying, this week there was a motion passed to...
the OAS motion.
The OAS motion. And just to explain what this is, this was a motion to try and increase the payout for people between the ages of, I believe, 65 and 75.
74.
74, sorry.
65 to 74.
65 to 74 to align
with... Because at 75, the other tranche begins.
Yeah, essentially, to align with what people over the age of 74 or 75 are receiving.
Let me take 5 seconds here just to explain that better. Your OAS rolls out in tranches depending on your age. It is a more generous payment when you are 75 or over. The Bloc has proposed that the benefits from 65 to 74 be increased to match the other level. That's basically the actual policy nut of what's being proposed. So,
and the Bloc has predicated their continued support of the Liberal government on the Liberal government's support of that expansion of entitlements. Yeah. So they've said to the Liberal government, they've said publicly, if you don't vote in favor of this by October 29th, we're out and we're going to start talking with the other parties to collapse your government. There was a non-binding vote on this in Parliament this week. And the Liberals actually voted against it. The Bloc, the NDP, and the Conservatives voted for it. And would we like me to start ranting at the Conservatives for voting for this now, or shall we put a pin in that for later?
Put a brief pin in it because I just want to contextualize all of this first.
Okay.
Couple of things that's going on. I know I promised you my Zeitgeist chat. It'll be later in the podcast. Mm-hmm. But I have noticed something in the last week or so. And you know the old story, right? Anecdotes, plural of anecdotes is not data, right? So sure. I have noticed something, and I've gut checked myself with a couple of smart sounding boards I use for this sort of thing, and everybody agrees. I think the Liberals as a party have gone through another psychological point where some of the ones who even up until after the LaSalle by-election in Quebec were still on the no, it's okay, we can do this. Some of them have now fallen off the radar. Mm-hmm. Some of them have just disappeared. And what I think is happening, based on having seen this before, is that they're sending out resumes. Yeah. And no one makes waves. It's like musical chairs, right? No one makes waves until they've got that gig lined up. So they're all 100% foursquare behind the leader. But the moment that law firm says, yeah, we can bring you on, they're gone. And it's just been interesting because I have had a few private conversations. I'm obviously not going to air anyone's dirty laundry here, but this whole thing is unspeakably familiar. This is the 2018 Ontario election all over again, where as we get close, some of those last ones in the bunker start suddenly coming up with excuses to go visit the troops in the West. And I've seen this before, and I don't mean in the abstract. I have seen this before. And there are going to be people who will be found with the prime minister in the bunker when this is all over. And I've been joking with some friends this week about making guesses about which ministers will never flee. Some of the other ones who even a month ago were loyal are now considering their options. And I had a great talk with a couple of friends this week who are more liberal inclined than I am. And they have it's a hard reentry, Jen, when you... the longer you deny reality, the harder the reality hits when you accept it. You're supposed to take that stuff in little sips, not one fire hose right to the face. And there's a lot of that going on. But I say this, Jen, the NDP still does not want to vote right now. So they're in a real bind. I think the Bloc is going to move in alignment with the Conservatives. The NDP, they don't have money.
No, but they're in a bind of their own making, so I have no empathy for them.
Yeah.
But speaking of Justin Trudeau in the bunker, did you have an opportunity to take a look at Justin's a podcast with Liberal MP Nate Erskine-Smith?
No, I am going to listen to it. At one point this weekend, I'm going to have it's about an hour long. What I did yesterday, I peeked at it. It's like 58 minutes. I'm like, I don't have 58 minutes to spare today, but I know on the weekend I need to have at least a drive of an hour and a half. So I'm going to download it and listen to it on the weekend. From what I've read, Paul Wells has done a couple of articles about it, some long reviews of the podcast. And I will tell you that in my conversations this week about how 2018 Kathleen Wynne feels, the Erskine-Smith podcast has been referenced more than once.
Okay, so I mean, the vibe just from the clips that I've seen so far, I've only seen the highlights yet. The vibe from that clip is high delulu. It's extreme. We're coming back any day now. Maybe we made some mistakes. We should have gone harder on Pierre Poilievre earlier, but like the cavalry is coming over the hill. Have faith. Are great champions. I mean, again, it is astonishing to me, and all partisans fall into this trap where they fall into partisan brain. They fall into the informational void brain, and so therefore your sense of reality is conditioned by what the people around you say and believe, or at least say. Conservatives fall into this trap. NDPers fall into this trap. Journalists fall into a version of this trap too. Like we all have this problem, but sometimes you get a glimpse into what's happening inside another partisan bubble, and it is just wow o'clock. I would start off just by saying, like, what is the value add of Justin Trudeau, from just communications point of view, of having Justin Trudeau do a podcast with a member of the Liberal caucus? Like, sorry, Matt, you just cut out here. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I was muted there. My bad. I think I have a literal answer for that. Yeah. Nate had broken the PM's balls a bit for going on Colbert, but not his show. So I think it might have been sort of yeah, okay, you're right.
But was he? I mean, like, seriously, because you're not talking, you are just rallying your own internal troops at that point. You are not talking to anyone outside.
I think the Liberal troops are the problem right now for the Prime Minister.
Well, and maybe that's what that's communicating to us. Yeah. Maybe what's communicating to us is that by him going and spending time with Nate Erskine-Smith, they're more concerned with what's happening internally than what's happening externally. So that's just an interesting thing to be aware of and to know. Matt, I do want to rant about the Conservatives. Firstly, we're going to
let me sneak in my one last point then before that, because I'm going to yield the floor to you for the rant. One of the really interesting things that I think is, two quick things. First of all, for those in the bunker still who think the Prime Minister has a chance to turn this around, or that there's going to be some October surprise equivalent for Canadian politics, or Poilievre's going to step in it, whatever, there's a really interesting thing going on. Mm-hmm. The more Liberals quit, the harder it's going to become for these guys to ever turn it around. And I don't know if anyone's thought about that yet. Like, they're already losing cabinet ministers. Half the caucus didn't show up at the retreat. If Justin Trudeau is hit by like rejuvenating lightning tomorrow and he gets like the gift of God level politics back, the party infrastructure is falling apart.
Yeah.
And I don't know if people have thought about that yet. The other thing, Jen, and I'm not smart enough to go on at length about this. Some of my nerdy friends are telling me about the procedural wheelings and dealings that we're going to start seeing more of.
And I think that we need to get into that, because even for people who aren't deep in the nerd trap, you need to have a basic understanding of what's happening procedurally to understand what the odds are of a general election in the immediate term. So, Matt, you're probably going to be able to explain the procedural stuff better than I can, but like just as an overview. Barely. Yeah, just as an overview, my money is still spread very evenly between an election anytime between now and 2026 at this point. Like, I've got an equal amount of money on 2 weeks from now. I've got an equal amount of money on before December. I've got an equal amount of money on before or as a result of the budget in March or April. I could see this. I could see the Trudeau's government trying to string this out to October, although, my God, you'd be insane by the end of it because it's just going to be this for the next year and you're going to get nothing done. And I don't think it's totally outside the realm of insane probability that some kind of deal gets struck between the NDP and the Liberals, or some kind of deal gets struck between the NDP and the Bloc and the Liberals to potentially, like, I don't know, change the fixed election date to push it to what's constitutionally possible. I think the probability of that is extremely low, but like anything's possible in this crazy at this point. So, Matt, if you could just sort of give us a very brief overview of what the procedural situation is.
Okay, it's going to be very brief out of necessity because I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I have been talking with some people the last couple of days. But when the government, basically kind of just the big picture questions, when is the government funded to? When must it introduce a budget? If it prorogues, when could it prorogue? Like just kind of trying to understand all the possible contingencies here. The Conservatives right now have some motions of privilege before the House regarding the sharing of documents. If they rag the puck on this, and I think they are, they can burn some calendar days. Because there are only limited sitting days left in the parliamentary calendar. This is going to put the government in a position where they are not going to have the room to maneuver that they might have expected before the next opposition opportunity to have a confidence vote comes true. And they're also going to burn the ability of the government to get stuff done in the remaining time that they have. One of the things that the prime minister can do at any time, and he does not need parliament to do this, is he can walk across the courtyard over to visit the governor general and ask her in English, obviously, to prorogue parliament. And that's not an act of legislature. That's the executive. That's royal assent. So the Conservatives can be doing cartwheels in the House, burning as much calendar time as they want. But if the governor general agrees to prorogue, it's done. It's prorogued. I don't know if they're going to do that. I honestly don't, because if they do, the Liberals are going to lose some of the work they've done on some stuff that they're not going to want to give up on. But I think there's a chance, and you and I have talked about this quite a bit in recent weeks, they're all trying to play 4D chess against each other, but I think the odds are pretty high that we're going to have a chaotic breakdown and an election that no one really planned. But this whole parliament feels like a disaster waiting to happen, and I'm not sure we even have to wait. It could be unfolding now.
Yeah, I mean, let's check our news before we definitely hit the publish button. There we go. So there's a couple things on the proroguement side. I mean, again, we've been talking about the possibility of the Liberals proroguing for the last couple of weeks. The thing that I think people need to understand about the prorogue possibility is that if the government prorogues, which is to call a halt to the session, that means that when the session comes back, when they reopen the session, they have to have a throne speech, and a throne speech becomes a confidence motion as a matter of constitutional norms. So if they prorogue, that potentially buys them some amount of time between one day and a year, or whatever they want to do. But when they come back, they have to have the confidence of the House. They need to prove that they have the confidence of the House. Second problem with proroguement is that I think that hypothetically the longest you could prorogue government would be, for example, the budget, because the budget is the fundamental means by which power is allocated in our democracy. So it's how you allocate funds, right? So there's a point at which the previous budget, which was approved by Parliament, essentially runs out. You run out of money. You run out of money to do stuff. And you have to bring that Parliament back in order to pass some kind of either economic statement or budget in order to keep the money flowing from the Treasury. So that's what they have to do. Now, what I don't know, and what I don't think anyone's been able to tell me quite firmly, is does that mean that a proroguement would have to stop sometime in spring in order to bring back everybody to vote on a budget? Or could they do something similar to what they did during COVID, and that is extend the previous budget for however many months longer? I don't know. So is it hypothetically possible for the Liberal government to go into proroguement for a year? I don't think it's morally correct But is it procedurally possible? I don't think anybody has a straight answer for me there on that. We'll look into it.
Someone would know, but
someone would know, but I don't.
I haven't found that person to ask them yet.
Now, that being said, do I think that that's a high probability? No, because what happened, if you go back in time and remember what happened when Harper's Conservative tried to prorogue Parliament, and I believe they only got like 6 weeks out of this.
Yep.
There were literal protests in the streets because Harper was incorrectly using proroguement to try and fend off a confidence motion to buy himself more time. He only got it.
They called it Canadians Against Proroguing Parliament.
My husband was one of the Calgary organizers, in fact. And so this was nerd total, right? But you're going to tell me that in the current moment, when the hatred of Justin Trudeau and this government is as high as it is, they try to prorogue. I mean, Harper got 6 weeks. You're going to tell me they're going to get away with 3 months before we're dealing with serious protests? I think you're now flirting with another trucker convoy style breakdown of law and order here. If you actually think you're going to get away with that for any length of time, and by the way, in this case, correctly, because you should not be using proroguement in this way.
Let's break that down into small pieces, though. Like, let's break this whole thing down into smaller bites. First of all, what is the incentive of the Liberals to prorogue? And I think it's actually a fairly easy answer.
Yes.
I think everybody is picking up on the vibe of chaos in Ottawa, and proroguing is sort of like sending the teams back to the dressing room for a couple of minutes while the refs get everything sorted out on the ice. Everybody down the tunnels, go to your rooms, take 5 minutes. We're going to restart the next. We're calling the period. We're going to add 4 minutes on the clock after the next intermission. Coaches, settle down your teams. I think that is the tactical purpose of a proroguement right now, especially with the Liberals. Shit's getting crazy. Chaos looms. They're the vulnerable ones. Call proroguement, calm everybody down, let the temperatures come down a bit.
And I think you can get away with that for a couple weeks.
Even a couple of months. The question I have for the Liberal, because here's the thing, if they do it fast, they're going to get over Christmas. So I could see them going, look, we're going to prorogue it for December, over November. Everybody go home for Christmas. We're going to pick this up again after the new year. I think they could stick that. The question I would then have,
and it's hard to imagine that Canadians in CAP or Canadians Against Proroguement is going to reform over Christmas. I would agree with that. Yeah.
So this is why I told you I've been looking at calendars this week, actually trying to figure out how this goes. The question I would then have is, what do the Liberals do at the time? Let's say hypothetically they prorogue for 3 months. They could prorogue for 3 months for the attitude of everybody back to the dressing room, chill out, everybody go get a massage, have a cocktail, like calm down, and we're gonna talk with the Bloc. We're gonna talk with the NDP. We might even talk with the Conservatives. Like, we're gonna try and settle things down.
Or the
other option is the Liberals try something in that 3 months.
Or what they treat it as is a time to try and get their own internal troops back in shape.
Yeah. They could also have Trudeau resign or announce that he will and organize a leadership race. So if they decide to do this, I understand why they might try it. They're going to have to decide what they would want to do at the time. I don't know what they're going to do.
Well, but the problem is that I don't think the time actually buys them anything. And I think that this is where you get the Lululand partisanship divorced from consensus reality. There's still among some Liberal partisans this fantasy that something is going to change that will change their fortunes, and all they need to do is get to the next marker, right? Like, Trump will get reelected, that'll change things, like whatever. I think that's wrong. I think that essentially the longer they draw this out, the worse it's going to get for them, because there's no cavalry coming from behind the hill here. So buying time doesn't actually buy you anything that materially changes your circumstances. It just pisses more and more people off.
I think a neutral observer from 10,000 feet above all this would probably try to tell the Liberals what I've been trying to tell them for months now, which is you can't avoid a loss, but you can choose how you lose.
That's right.
And I think what the danger the Liberals are in is that they're going to do tactical maneuver after tactical maneuver to keep themselves alive another day, another week, another month, to their own eventual misfortune. If I'm advising the Prime Minister right now, for his sake, his party's sake, and arguably the country's sake, election soon, election now, because this isn't going to work.
No.
And it's only going to make everything worse for everybody the longer this goes on. but his own personal political imperatives are different. So I think this is going to go on until either it does drag out to the bitter end and we all hate each other by the end of it,
including
or
you and me.
it's going to collapse fast.
Yeah, or including you and me. You and I will be at each other's throats if we're still doing this in a year.
I mean, just bring back the librarian glasses. You'll buy a lot of sympathy.
Well, that's fair.
Okay, I've punted you a couple of times on your conservative rant. I yield the floor to you. Go get them.
Okay, I'm going to come back to the pin that I wanted to talk about earlier about the Conservatives voting in favor of the OAS eligibility expansions. I know that sounds like a really nerdy sentence, but it's important, so bear with me. And I'm also going to recognize right off the bat that it's a non-binding motion, so it's a really easy motion for a Conservative to vote for, knowing full well that it's going to actually make no material difference. But I'm going to reiterate something that we were talking about last week, and that is my fear that the Conservatives, fully acknowledging that the current Liberal government is reached the end of its lifespan, this government is dead and rotting. Okay, we all acknowledge that. My concern is that Canada has very, very significant problems, big, deep problems that need somebody with a real electoral mandate and a real vision to come in and reform, and that the Conservatives, as they are currently constructed, are not psychologically or morally well equipped to deal with those problems. My concern with the Conservatives is not that they're mega light. My concern with them is that they're not serious, that they're going to come into power and they're going to continue to do shallow, petty little bullshit score settling, as opposed to dealing with reforming our foreign policy, fixing our military, coming up with an industrial policy, addressing the oligopolies, trying to regain something resembling economic competitiveness and innovation, addressing our housing policy, and dealing with immigration, like the really big picture stuff that the country really needs to get on track and is going to take time and a real mandate to get on track. They're not going to do any of that because that stuff's hard. So instead, it's going to be easy, petty, shallow shit like, we'll repeal the carbon tax and we'll, get pissy with the media and we'll defund the CBC, which again, we're going to put a pin in next. We'll come back to that. Again, it's top tier shallow shit, while all the stuff below the surface that requires real difficult reform and work just doesn't get addressed. And we continue in the current path of, for lack of a term, sclerotic decline, which will over time make more and more Canadians more and more alienated with the political process because, you Conservatives came into power with this strong reform mandate and nothing is really materially getting better. Nothing's really improving in any significant way. So that's my...
You described it really well in our last written dispatch, Jen, where you had said the Conservatives won't do the hard stuff because the easy, cheap stuff will work just fine.
Yeah, they'll get the same emotional payoff with the easy, cheap stuff.
And votes. And fundraising.
And to me, I kind of lost my shit when I saw the Conservatives vote in favor of the OAS eligibility expansion, because to me, it was another sign that that's exactly what we have here. So let's talk for a minute about why the OAS expansion of eligibility is a really, really bad idea. And I'm saying that knowing very well that polling's come out saying that this is really popular. Lots of people from right across the demographic spectrum really love this idea of expanding OAS eligibility for people between the ages of 65 and 74 or thereabouts. Really popular. People love it. And that's because they don't understand what it is. Like, I'm sorry, that's the problem. So we're still operating in this kind of fantasy land where we treat seniors and the elderly as this very maligned, impoverished class of people who need extra support and extra care. And that was the kind of mythology that created OAS and CPP in the first place. This idea that we need to protect our seniors because once they stop losing the ability to work, they're on fixed incomes, they need all of our support. And back when OAS and CPP was designed, that was true. Like, seniors were a comparatively impoverished demographic within the country, and they did need entitlements in order to get to live a comfortable life. In this godforsaken year 2024, that is not true. Overwhelmingly, the boomers of this country are the wealthiest demographic, not only in Canadian history, but they're the wealthiest existing demographic. Not only with their comparatively high public pensions, their private pensions, which are radically beyond what any of us under the age of 60 are ever going to see, and they're sitting on shit tons of housing stock. millions of dollars, billions of dollars of housing.
I think, Jen, it could be trillions.
Trillions, exactly. And the amount of money that they've invested in the housing market also has a lot to do with why Canada's uncompetitive and non-innovative. That's another rant for another day. The idea that like boomers in this country are grandma Karens sitting at the table counting pennies and living on cat food is from a population perspective completely not true. They are by far the wealthiest demographic in the country. And by the way, that's good. You want people to be wealthier as they get older. That's sign of accumulation of wealth over time. There's nothing wrong with that. That's great. If you've done well as a boomer in this country, I say, good for you. No issues with you as an individual. But as a population, it's something that you have to consider when you're talking about how to allocate taxpayer dollars and entitlements. Okay? Because if you are talking about, for example, a targeted subsidy for low-income seniors, that's fine. I've got no issue with that. But when you're talking about a universal increase of wealth, a wealth transfer to the wealthiest demographic in the country, and you're not income targeting that in any meaningful way, all you're doing at that point is you're engaging in a giant intergenerational wealth transfer from the youngest Canadians to the oldest ones, and you're doing it for purely political purposes because old people vote. That's the only reason why you would do that. It's terrible economic policy. It further disadvantages the poorest people in the country. And by the way, people under the age of 60 in this country are not on the same wealth track that the boomers were. And the younger you are, the more the gap between your path and the boomers' paths actually are. Secondly,
you and I in our early 40s are way better off than the 30s.
100%. Yeah, exactly. And they're on a way better track than people in their 30s. 20s, exactly. Yeah. So like the intergenerational wealth gap is growing wider and wider and wider as time goes by. And I would just say also, like, you can have a society where you are transferring money from the youngest to the oldest when you have a healthy population pyramid, when you have a demographic pyramid that looks like this. I'm holding my hands up. It looks like a pyramid, right? So you have young people coming into the system at a healthy rate, and they're supporting a declining number of people at the top of the pyramid. That's healthy. That's a sign of economic growth. Money's coming into the system. The youngest people in the system can support the oldest people in the system. That's fine. You can afford to have that intergenerational wealth transfer in that environment. That is not what our demographic pyramid looks like right now in Canada. If you look at our demographic pyramid in Canada right now, it doesn't look like a pyramid. It looks like a Venus of Willendorf. Okay? It looks like a big bulb where the boomers come. And then there's like a gap for the Gen X. And then there's another big bulb for the millennials, but not as large as the boomers. And then it starts to go down and collapse. And if you want to understand why Canada has taken on so many immigrants in the last decade,
it's trying to fix the pyramid.
We're trying to fix the pyramid. It's actually not crazy conspiracy great replacement theory. It's that we don't have enough people coming in at the bottom of the pyramid to justify and support the entitlement programs, which are overwhelmingly being funneled to the top of the pyramid. So we're trying to rectify that problem by bringing more and more working age young people in, to the detriment of those very social entitlements, to the detriment of our housing policy, to the detriment of all kinds of other issues. So the Conservatives know this. They know everything that I've just explained to you. They know that transferring more money to the wealthiest people in a universal fashion and rather than an income targeted fashion, not only is that going to cost the Treasury sort of an estimated $3 billion per year, or an estimated $16 billion over 5 years, which is money that at this point we can no longer afford to justify. Not only do they know that it's an intergenerational transfer of wealth, disadvantaging the very people who they're trying to help with their supposed housing policies, they completely understand that it's terrible economic policy. It's just brutal economic policy that once implemented would be very, very difficult to roll back. But they voted for it anyway. And I understand it's a non-binding motion, but they voted for it anyway. Matt, why did they vote for this terrible economic policy that they know very well is bad economic policy?
I don't know.
I know why.
Own the libs.
No, I know exactly why.
Because they don't want to be pissing off the olds.
That's exactly right. Because they don't want to be characterized as, you're going to go after grandma's pension fund. You're going to blah, 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 blah. You're going to piss off the olds. They don't want to piss off.
The Liberals were on the right side of this issue. The
Liberals are absolutely on the right side of this issue. And the Conservatives took the chicken shit move and they voted for the OAS expansion, even though, again, non-binding motion, because they knew that if they didn't vote for it, they'd get tarred with it. And to me, that's the perfect example of the way the incentives are aligning in the system against actually fixing real systemic problems and for doing shallow political bullshit. And thus endeth my economic lecture / angry political rant about the future conservative government of Canada. And on that note, I think we need to like and subscribe. Subscribe.
Let's like and subscribe. The only thing I'm going to add, Jen, is to say that one of the things I think people don't realize, and that I didn't realize until I began to actually pay attention to it, is the rage and the alienation in the 20-somethings and 30-somethings.
Rightly.
Yeah, you know what? I'm not even, yes, but that's not even the point I'm making. It's just, I think there's a significant segment of the population that does not realize how fucking furious another segment of the population is at them.
And makes no attempt to try to understand why.
Don't you know that some Thai-based polling company just ranked Canada number 4 on quality of living based on an attitudinal survey of 30 Spanish high school students?
Aren't you aware that we too had to deal with high inflation for a period of time in the 80s?
You know what this is, Jen? It's a phrase that's popped in my mind a couple times in recent weeks. This is whistling past the graveyard.
Yeah.
Like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe. This episode of The Line has been brought to you by Unsmoke Canada, which is dedicated to helping Canadians who are looking to quit smoking understand the full range of options available. Despite decades of government programs and regulations, today nearly 5 million Canadian adults smoke cigarettes. Adult smokers who choose to continue to smoke should be aware that other options exist. Right now, accessing information about these options is heavily restricted in Canada. While not risk-free, alternatives such as heated tobacco and vaping products provide a potentially less harmful choice than cigarettes. Cigarettes burn tobacco, resulting in smoke that contains 6,000 harmful chemicals that are associated with smoking-related disease and death. Heating tobacco and vaping products have the potential to significantly reduce this risk. Health agencies around the world are now considering these alternatives to help end smoking. Updated laws can help adult smokers better understand the full range of options available, including the relative risk of these products. Millions of Canadians smoke cigarettes. Technology exists that can help change that, but policymakers need to take action. Learn about how a smoke-free future can be achieved at unsmoke.ca.
Jen and I had time for a quick cry.
Calm down.
Yeah, we're great. Okay, let's get that blood pressure right back up. A CBC mandate review. So just the actual literal context of this is we don't have a lot of detail yet. We're operating on a couple of news stories, including, ironically, from the CBC, that the federal government is going to announce soon, this month, or maybe very early next month, significant changes at the CBC, including a mandate review for CBC News. There is some time pressure here. The Heritage Minister, Pascal Saint-Onge, is heading off on paternity leave, which, just a brief note of humanity, is obviously great. All the best to the minister and her family on that front. But she's going to have an acting minister take over in the next couple of weeks, which puts some time pressure on the government's agenda. And the government wants to overhaul the CBC with more of a focus on local news and targeting news deserts. So, Jen, in theory, I give this thumbs up. This is something you and I have been calling for. Your great column on this a couple of months ago almost called exactly for that. Some other things as well, but that was the crux of it.
Yep.
The problem we run into here is, I would just say, a credibility and deliverology problem here.
Yeah.
Given everything we've just discussed in the first segment, the Liberals coming out with a plan to overhaul the CBC and do a mandate review now is about as credible as if the Canadian Space Agency was to announce the Canadian Lunar Exploration Program, and if Melanie Joly was to call for a Middle East peace summit to produce results in time for Thanksgiving. Sorry guys, this is stuff that a hyper-confident government that was laser-focused, just had reams of political capital and a cabinet flush of genuine political talents all that being the case, it would still take a full majority mandate to do what they're taking on here. To announce it now,
in the verge
is a
of
joke.
Is chaos. Okay, so I mean, I've written about the conservative case for a CBC overhaul. I've been trying to dissuade conservatives from a total defund motion because I think that I'm not sure they've thought. I think they're allowing their emotion about the state of the CBC to overwhelm the role that a public broadcaster can and ought to have in a Canadian media landscape. And I say that as someone who believes that the CBC as it exists right now can no longer sustain itself. It doesn't have the public support that it fundamentally needs to continue to operate using taxpayer dollars. I think you need not just a mandate review. I think you need a radical overhaul about what the CBC is doing and what function it exists to serve. Okay. A CBC that actually went through a true mandate review would look nothing like the CBC that it does today. And a CBC that went through a true mandate review is going to be hyper-focused on serving Canadians at a local level and at an intellectual level as well. So like the idea that you're going to have a CBC where the ideology of a country is dictated from the annex, that is not a sustainable idea for the CBC. That's what it's been allowed to become. And I think the reason why it's been allowed to become that has to do with the fact that it has a very vague, weakly worded mandate kind of shoehorned into the Broadcasting Act. And I don't think that that is adequate in statute to provide the direction that we actually need the public broadcaster to have. So that's just my opinion. You could take it or leave it. You read it on the line. Go to www.readtheline.ca. It's actually one of the most popular pieces I've ever done.
Yeah.
Really raised fantastic debate in our comments section as well. I really love our paid commentators when they bring that level A game to our comment section. I thought that there were some really good comments in there. So if Pascal Saint-Onge is coming forward with a mandate review that looks kind of like aligned to what I had written about, or what a lot of people have been saying the CBC needs to become, I say great in theory.
Yeah.
Great in theory. Golf clap. In practice, you're dealing with, and this is where I think that the disconnect between the political side and the functional arm of a crown corporation or a private sector or government is unbridgeable. CBC is a massive corporation. It's a massive corporation of 5,000 people. To overhaul the CBC to the degree that you would need to overhaul it to restore a lot of public confidence in it and make it a functional organization again is not like I bashed off a mandate review on the back of a napkin after 6 weeks of work before going on mat leave.
We had ChatGPT fire up a quick CBC mandate.
I mean, this is something that's going to require significant input from members of staff. It's going to require significant input from people right across the country, frankly, because it's all our taxpayer money. But what we're looking for, it's going to require a very thoughtful and thorough, probably statute. It's probably going to need a law in and of itself. It probably needs to be the CBC law. It probably can't be like a little mandate inside the Broadcasting Act. So it needs to be written in law. And then it's going to need actual managerial competence to execute, because you need to totally restructure a massive corporation from top to bottom. I mean, I would love to tell you that I could come in tomorrow and become the CBC CEO and do this, but I can't. I do not have anything resembling the managerial talent to do something like that. Like, this is actually the place where you do need like a McKinsey or an organization, a managerial consultancy to engage in something like this at that level. Like, it's not something that I think you can do in a half-assed or
have Carney do it.
Way.
Put
have
it on
Carney
his
do
list.
it. Sure, great. But I mean, like it would be a multi-years long process. It involves restructuring where people physically live. I don't think you could have a CBC that's highly centralized in downtown Toronto, for example,
Ottawa,
which means
Montreal. Yeah.
It means someone's going to have to address the CBC union.
Mm-hmm.
And get real
Radio
brutal.
Canada. You're going to have to figure out how this is going to work in
How
English
are you
and
going to
in
work
French.
through this? It means having a conversation about where physical plant is located and whether or not it makes sense to have the physical plant located where it is, which involves serious real estate transactions. Like, I don't know, maybe equipment,
like transmitters, like actual physical
like
infrastructure, satellites,
like
foreign bureaus.
It is a very significant managerial task that is going to take years to execute.
Or we could do it in 6 weeks now.
Or we can do it in 6 weeks with a drummed off new mandate. I mean, this doesn't have credibility. I think that you're right. This doesn't have credibility. What this has to me is like, we're going to have a mandate review where nothing really, really materially changes, but maybe we'll end the current CEO's Catherine Tate's term in January and hire someone new.
Expiring in January,
Expiring in January. And we'll hire someone new so that it looks like a shiny new CBC, and maybe that will protect the CBC when the Conservatives come to power with a kind of a gloss of lipstick. Maybe that's the intent here. But I just think that is disconnected from the reality of the scope of the work that's involved.
I agree. I agree with everything you just said there.
Well, we should disagree more. It would make the podcast better if we fought more.
Well, I'm going to add a couple of things. I'll do that.
Okay. All right.
One of the things that we touched on: physical plant and infrastructure, real estate holdings, technological stuff. Yeah. CBCs would have to make decisions around formats and content choices, entertainment versus news, all of the stuff that Jen's talking about. One of the things, Jen, you didn't touch on, and I think actually it's the most central part of your argument, is trust.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
If the CBC is going to open a bureau in Lethbridge, or maybe it has one there.
They just opened one, actually.
Okay, well,
yeah.
Pick some other random Western town in Canada.
Medicine Hat.
Sure. What are you going to do to earn the trust of the people there?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's impossible, and I'm not saying it's not worth trying, but I'm saying I don't know if Pascal Saint-Onge is going to be able to do that when coming fresh off paternity leave. And I'm not saying this to be flippant. I mean this very sincerely. There's 2 or 3 years of my life I don't remember when my kids were younger. You take a minister who's physically exhausted, in a government that is politically exhausted, in a parliament that has become completely non-functional, and you take on something that is structurally important to the future of the country. I think it's a bad idea. And I 100% support a CBC mandate review. I 100% support a mandate review along the line Jen has laid out. I think there's a real chance right now they're going to pick this thing up off the shelf and break it. And they're going to make it worse. And I have a hunch, Jen, and this is the other point I was going to add, because I agreed with all your other points. I have a hunch the only reason they're doing this is to make it a topic for the election. The Conservatives are very clear in what they intend to do with the CBC. They're going to shut it down, and they're going to sell the physical plant, and they're going to turn it into housing. And this is something that they're not subtle about. It's funny, the Liberals, we should have mentioned this in the first segment, but as part of the dysfunctional parliament, the Liberals are already trotting out the old hidden agenda trope, talking about that this week. Oh, Pierre Poilievre's hidden agenda. There's nothing hidden about Poilievre's CBC agenda. He's going to kill it.
Yep.
There might be some ambiguity. I think there is some ambiguity about what he'll do with Radio-Canada. But for English language CBC, he's going to put a bullet in its head and then build houses on the corpse. Mm-hmm. So there's no hidden agenda here. And I think what the Liberals are trying to do is make this something that during the election, they can go, this man wants to burn our precious CBC down. Doesn't he know we're in the process of this incredible coast to coast to coast review of how this institution can better save Canadians? I think they knew if they went into the election and they had to defend the CBC on the merits of what it is, they would lose.
They could.
So I think they want to fight the next election on the merits of what it could be.
Right.
I think this is 100% a political play.
I think that's exactly right. And I have how should I say this? I think that would be a really interesting policy debate for an election. I think that's valid. However,
if we did that,
if we were actually doing that, and I thought this might be an interesting only Nixon can go to China situation. It might be that in order for the CBC
only Pierre Poilievre can save the CBC.
Yeah, in order to genuinely rebuild the trust between CBC and a lot of people, particularly outside of a very few urban centers, you do need a conservative government or a conservative-minded group of people to do an actual proper mandate review. I just, like I said, the problem that I have is that I don't see a conservative government that's treating that idea seriously. I see a government that wants to do high symbolic value stuff like sell the CBC HQ, which, by the way, I don't actually think it's a bad idea. I don't think it's a bad idea to sell the CBC HQ. I think a proper CBC should be way more decentralized than it currently is. And I think one of the major problems with the CBC is that it generates too much of its staff from a narrow geographic space. My experience with the CBC out here in Alberta.
It's the Toronto-Montreal corridor.
It's the Toronto-Montreal corridor. My experience with the CBC Calgary is that the CBC Calgary is great. You know what I mean? Like the CBC Calgary is fantastic.
Yeah, you know what? I haven't worked with them as closely as you do, but I find and I'm not knocking the guys at CBC Toronto Montreal because I think they have great local teams too. But
the local teams are great.
The bureaus in Western Canada are actually genuinely really good, and I think, Jen, it's a bit of a survival adaptation. They have to be. They
have to be good, right? And also the Alberta CBC also, I think, has just put money into like a bureau in Lethbridge, so they get it. Like, I really do think that a lot of the bureaus outside of the corridor do absolutely get it, and their local teams are great. And I don't want to see those local teams go away, because I think what people don't realize is you get rid of a lot of these local teams, and there's nothing coming in the door to replace them. Like, we're just going to get news deserts, and increasingly news deserts in cities, in places where we can't afford that. So
Toronto, if something happens in the city of Toronto, at the center of a media market of 10 million Canadians, something happens in Toronto after 6 o'clock on a Sunday evening, it's a news desert.
Yeah. And that's terrifying even in Toronto. But I mean, even in places like mid-tier cities, Saskatoon, Regina, Moose Jaw, like we need something there. I do believe that. But
can I have a dark thought moment?
Let's have a dark thought moment.
It's not specific to the CBC, but I had an opportunity this week to it was an off-the-record conversation with a private organization, but I had a great lunch where I gave some remarks, and one of the topics was news deserts, and we just had that terrible hurricane wallop the southeast United States, and there's been tremendous damage and loss of life in North Carolina, and we don't fully understand how bad it is, or we're only starting to get the scope of how bad it is, because Western North Carolina is a news desert.
Right.
And for days, the only information coming out was Air National Guard helicopters doing low-level passes to do visual reconnaissance, and ham radio operators who had either a solar panel or a decent battery pack. That was the only information coming out of the area. And that's a huge swath of Canada today. But what worries me, Jen, is that it's too late to fix that, right? Because my old man used to get 2 newspapers at home, and it was part of the morning routine. Breakfast, coffee, newspaper. People used to get into the habit of putting the evening news on while they chopped veggies for dinner, or running out to the grocery store. I'm going to pop on the local AM radio news station and grab a couple of headlines. When I make dinner, I'm watching YouTube. Normally when I'm in my car, I'm listening to music. I am as plugged into news as they get. I don't subscribe to a physical print newspaper. My 12-year-old daughter once tried to open one and couldn't figure out how the pages folded. The whole pattern, lifestyle, habit of consuming news is gone. And if we start opening little mini CBC bureaus all over the country to represent cities, is anyone going to know they're there?
Well, maybe not. I think that's more of an existential issue.
They're all existential at this point, but yeah.
I think you have to treat this as a public good, right? Having I'm not even talking about political coverage here. I'm not. I'm literally talking like, do you have someone covering the court to tell you about the latest murder? Do you have someone on the scene when there's a flood? Like, we're talking that level of coverage. So we're not talking about the highly emotive political stuff that you and I do.
You know what it is, Jen? And this is dark, and forgive me, but you know what you need in every city across the country? You need someone that someone can go to if they've heard worrying rumors about what the high school gym coach is doing to some of the students.
Yes. That's right.
And unfortunately, his brother-in-law is the local chief of police, and there's been whispers. Or you're hearing that guys at City Hall, big contract passed, and the work was substandard, but they've all got new pickup trucks. There's got to be someone in the loop someone can go to and say, you've got to look at this.
Yeah.
if there's allegations of abuse or criminality or misconduct, if people are living in squalor and dying on the streets because the local health clinic is overwhelmed, there's got to be someone for someone to call. And right now, across most of this country, there isn't.
Well, I know, and I think that that feeds into the distrust of journalism generally, that there isn't, right? So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that my concern is that there are a lot of conservatives out there who think, well, we'll just blow up the CBC, and like 1,000 local public mom and pop journalism shops are going to bloom across the country. And in some cases, yeah, there will be a few. There will be some.
There will be some successes.
And there's going to be some successes, and God bless them.
Again, I live in the center of the largest city in the country. Media market of 10 million people. There's a handful in Toronto. How many are you going to see pop up in Medicine Hat, to your point?
Tell me why those people didn't pop up in the flood zone of North Carolina. Where are they there? Why are we relying on ham radio, guys? Right?
I think the problem, Jen, is that people can get kind of the empty calories version of the news. So I was talking about the news as a habit, right? Mm-hmm. People are scratching the itch, but they're scratching it with someone reacting on TikTok to a story about a transgendered person in the wrong bathroom in Denmark. Mm-hmm. So their brain is tricked into thinking they're still getting news. Oh, what are you talking about? I get news every day. Didn't you hear about this thing that just happened in Copenhagen?
Yeah.
But meanwhile, all the guys at your municipal works department have new F-150s in their driveways, and the concrete used in the bridge was substandard. Yeah. And you're never going to know it. But you think you're an informed citizen because you know about the bathroom thing in Copenhagen.
Yeah, that's I think right. Anyway, I don't want to go too much on that, but the CBC, I know that our listeners aren't necessarily big fans of us talking about media stuff, but that was in the news this week, covered by the CBC, and who would be around to tell us that the CBC is undergoing a major mandate review if they didn't get secret sources leaked to the CBC?
CBC mandate review, Canadian Lunar Settlement Program, Melanie Jolie Summit for Middle East Peace. This is all going to be announced by the government in the next couple of weeks, and then they'll prorogue the fucking thing.
Matt, you want to talk about the zeitgeist?
We'll talk about the zeitgeist. We'll come back in a moment. I'm going to zeitgeist you. Like and subscribe. All right. Zeitgeist time. Bit of a mood check. And we touched on this a little bit in the first segment, because one of the things I told you, Jen, was I'm getting the sense that sort of a new, I think the liberal line of psychological defense moved back a trench this week. I think they kind of, we can't hold this line. Let's fall back to the next one. And I think some of the people are going to be tapping out and going to rediscovering they have families or other political ambitions, blah, blah, blah. But I had another zeitgeist moment. And it was actually when I was reading Rob Shaw. We published him in the line on Friday morning. It went out. And hat tip to you, because you were the editor on that piece. I just gave it a quick read for typos and whatnot, so I didn't have to do the heavy lifting on it.
It was actually came very clean, so he did a great job.
Way to go, Rob.
If there's any other media people listening, don't you dare take Rob Shaw from us before the end of the election.
That's right. Reading his column, and again, I'm no expert in BC politics, so I'm going to put myself in his hands on that. One of the things that jumped out at me, and Rob didn't describe it this way, but it reminded me of conversations you and I have had quite a lot over the last year or so, that the pendulum has swung. And it's not, it will, or it is, it. I think now we can say it has. Because what Rob was writing about in his column is how the NDP, provincially in BC, are playing nasty. They are hammering the Conservatives, particularly John Rustad, the Conservative leader. They're hitting them hard. They're giving them everything they've got, and none of it's working. Mm-hmm. And you and I had talked about, and we talked about this in a couple of contexts, but one of the big ones we talked about was how starting, I think it was in New Brunswick, I think it was, maybe Nova Scotia, and then we saw it in Saskatchewan, and then we saw it in Alberta. We saw premiers picking up the trans issue and kind of going, interesting. What can we do with this? 3 or 4 years ago, they never would have touched it. Right. Would have been radioactive.
Yep.
And one of the things that you and I talked about, by the way, I also think this is the last podcast episode we're going to record before we hit the 1-year anniversary of October 7th. And I think those protests in the streets, pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, And I know people will go, no, it's not pro-Palestine, it's anti-Semitic, blah, blah. I'm not going to weigh into that. The opposing sides, there's been this pendulum movement back and forth. And I think we're looking at issues that would have been intensely politically toxic 5 years ago. Trans issues, vaccine stuff during the pandemic. Jen, the question I'm going to put to you is simply this. Have progressive politicians and fellow travelers, advocates in the online space or in meat space, have they realized that they're not going to be able to insult their way into winning debates anymore? Or kind of having, you've described it as almost sort of like a dictatorial conformity. Like, we're going to impose our views on you, and you're not going to believe them, but you're not going to argue them either. What Rob was describing in BC, to me, felt like another data point, and that whole era of politics in Canada is over.
I think that's right. I mean, I don't know if I'd phrase it exactly like that, but I think that 2020 was, okay, I'm not going to use the term woke politics. I understand that that is a problematic term and lots of people don't like using it or they feel like it's imprecise. But I don't know a better one. So let's
peak
just
woke.
go with it.
George Floyd riots was peak woke.
Because we all know what we're talking about here. We're talking about a kind of, hard left ideological position here that demanded a high degree of conformity and largely rejected liberal politics as a framework by which we traditionally mete out debates and manage debates.
And all in the framework of harm, where to discuss this is harm, to not comply with this is harm, to and words or violence, etc.
Words or violence, that kind of thing. So, I mean, one of the big problems with this is that when you kind of use words like peak woke, people who are woke will be like, well, we are just talking about equality. Like, well, no, you're not. Like, that's patently not the issue. All of us are on board with equality, for example. All of us are on board with not discriminating against people for race or gender or sex and things of that nature. Like, everybody's on board with that. What we're talking about here is the abandonment of a kind of liberal way, small L liberal way of managing policy disagreements and social disagreements, and an expectation that everybody will fall into line with, frankly, the most extreme position, left-wing position on X, Y, Z, race, gender, social issues. Take your pick, right? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about quote unquote woke politics. And I understand that it's an imprecise term and many people will debate what we mean by that. But as a general rule of thumb, I think most of those debates are disingenuous.
I'm with you. I got no better way to describe it.
Yeah, you know exactly what we mean by that. We hit the peak of that, I think, in 2020, and I think the pendulum's been sliding back ever since then. And I think right now what we're dealing with is probably in 2024 is the nadir of the pendulum. Now it's swinging to the other side. So now it's not only is it perfectly fine to dissent from or break ranks from the woke position, but
you will be rewarded for breaking ranks.
But now you're going to be rewarded for breaking ranks. You know what I mean? And that creates its own set of perverse incentives. Okay, and that's going to create its own set of issues here. And I don't know where that pendulum peaks and begins to come back again. Like, we could be 5-10 years out from that pendulum peaking, but we are now in the phase of, I think, of a reactionary political swing where people are not only not on board with woke politics, but now they're fucking angry about having to pretend that they were ever on board with this shit. And now they're going to go to another extreme and they're going to lose their equilibrium on the other side of this. So that, I think, is something that, we at Line are going to have to watch for, right? Because, I mean, I don't think that we want to be reactionary political figures ourselves. We don't. We want to approach our policy positions and our policy disagreements from a place of shared values and good faith, right? Like, that's the place where we want to come from. And that requires us to, how should I say this, fight against the momentum of gravity in both directions. So, I think that's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge for conservatives to make sure that they don't get into a position that is just as tyrannical and bad faith is what they accused the lefties of engaging in 2020. And I think that it's going to be a challenge to ensure I think it's going to be a challenge to ensure that people are making their policy decisions based on something other than anger, spitefulness, and revenge, right?
It's 100% going to be anger, spite, and revenge. I'm sorry. I have zero faith it won't be that.
And I think that's something we have to fight against. Like, I just don't think that is a good, because if that is what the momentum is allowed to take, it's going to swing back harder the next time. Like, every time you push the pendulum, it swings harder. Yeah. So, like, we can't allow ourselves to fall into that emotional trap. I really don't think that we can.
It's just, you could write a whole laundry list, Jen, of issues in Canada where we're seeing that right now. So we've vaccines was one of the ones Rob was talking about. Mm-hmm. We've already seen it, I think, with things like forced treatment for addiction and mental health issues. We are seeing it on crime issues. Just about a couple of days ago, I was making dinner, and every cop car in the city blew by my house moving fast. And a couple minutes later, there were helicopters hovering over my house, and I thought I should put on the news. And a Toronto cop had just been shot a few blocks from where I live by someone who was out on bail. Mm-hmm. And all these issues, some of it's really polarizing cultural stuff like the trans issues. Some of it's more law and order, bail, forced treatment. One of the ones I think we're seeing, and I think it's really horrifying, but it's predictable, and you and I were pretty clear on this at the time, the unmarked graves at residential schools. We're seeing the pendulum swing beyond, well, hang on, let's actually make sure there are human remains here, all the way into incidences of outright denialism. It's insane to me how many fronts this is unfolding on.
Can I just say, like, this is something that I want to make a point of here, is that if the Liberals are the types of people who genuinely believe that they could never do the things that they are actively doing, the Conservatives are demonstrating themselves to be the types of people who absolutely will do what they imagine the Liberals are doing. Yeah. So if you are operating under the assumption that, like, all of Canadian institutions are engaged in a conspiracy, in a dictatorial, oppressive conspiracy against you, then you have just morally justified your own conscious decision to engage in a dictatorial, oppressive conspiracy against your enemies, right? And that's where this pendulum goes, and, like, that leads us to a very, very ugly place. So let's not do that.
For the record, yeah, no, for the record, for viewers, I'm not crying. I just had an eyelash in my eye, but I got it out, so that was great. Jen's words are stirring and moving, but it was the eyelash that was getting me there. I think the Conservatives in this country went insane in 2019, and I think the Liberals went insane in 2019 too. I think the near win for the Conservatives in the 19 election and the near loss for the Liberals in the 19 election broke both of them differently. But I think the Conservative Party today still cannot believe they lost the brownface election, and they are here to be heard. They're going to put heads on pikes when they win the next one, and they will have their revenge in this life or the next.
On that pleasant thought, let's quickly finish up the podcast by talking about chemtrails.
Chemtrails, okay.
Chemtrails. As if this were like and subscribe. So look, in Alberta this week, another interesting story wound its way through the gossip mill. It wasn't a gossip story. It was a reported on story. Premier Danielle Smith did a town hall in which somebody started to ask her about chemtrails. And her response was, well, I've looked into it, investigated it. We don't have, I'm sorry, in case you're not aware, the chemtrails conspiracy is that the contrails, the big white contrails that you see in the sky after a jet has flown over. Goes through. Yeah. A jet goes through.
Yeah, like a nice blue sky, and you got like this nice white line of cloud. Yeah.
Generally speaking, there's a long-standing, this is not a new conspiracy theory, a long-standing conspiracy theory that some entity, probably some entity within the U.S. government, has secretly installed chemical compressors of some kind and put them into all private jets in the country, and that these chemicals are being sprayed into the atmosphere for any number of pick your reason. Usually the most obvious one is mind control. In order, they're trying to keep the population.
Mind control, or I've seen one version of it where it is folded in with the Great Replacement theory, where it's sterilizing white people.
Sterilizing white people, of course.
Yeah.
This is bananas. There's no evidence for this. I'm sorry, there just isn't. There's no good evidence for this. I'm not interested in arguing it. I'm just not. So Daniel Smith
invited into the comments.
Oh,
so
I know.
For the commenters, just so you know, we will ignore your posts and probably delete them.
Yeah, no, we won't delete them. Just whatever, do whatever you want. But like, I'm not going to entertain the chemtrails conspiracy theory. This is up there with like they're making the frogs gay shit. I don't have the intellectual or I don't have the emotional energy to engage in this.
You know why you don't?
Well, because it's the chemtrails, of course.
Yeah.
So anyway, somebody in a town hall, a UCP town hall, goes to Danielle Smith and says, have you looked into the chemtrails? And half of her response wasn't totally unreasonable. It was to the effect of, well, I've looked into it. I've talked to XYZ people about it within the government, and there's no real evidence for this. Half of her response then went to the effect of, and if the US government were doing this, there's nothing we could do about it because I'm just the leader of a regional blah, blah, blah power. And the Department of Defense has the ability to do whatever it wants.
Didn't NORAD put out a statement?
I didn't see. Did the NORAD put out a statement? You'd know better than
NORAD or department, like someone in the U.S. military actually.
Somebody, I think the CBC actually went to the Department of Defense and was like, could you please respond to this?
Imagine being that guy at the Pentagon.
It's like, fuck you.
You're sitting at your desk in the Pentagon, sipping your coffee, and your email goes bing, and you look at it and you're like, hey, who? Huh?
So look, people believe all kinds of crazy shit. I believe crazy shit, whatever. And as a person in position of authority, I'm going to most charitably, a person in position of authority, you have the right to ask your premier whatever you want. And the premier, I think, has the right to respond by saying she's heard your concerns and taken them into account, even if she personally happens to think they're crazy. Here's my issue is that I think there's a line between I've looked into this and there's no evidence and dropping the topic there and then there's a line that goes further and says, oh, but if it were true, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, there's nothing we could do about it because it's the Department of Defense. And Daniel Smith crossed that line from allaying fears into, basically feeding into the conspiracy. I'm one of you, really, wink, wink. And that's how it comes across to me. Whether or not she actually believes in the chemtrail conspiracy or not, I honestly don't know. I honestly don't. I can't be inside her head. Would it be part and parcel with other conspiracies that she's given credence to in the past? Yes, which is why I can't rule out the possibility that she does believe it. Look, I've often said that sometimes people's biggest strengths hide the seeds of their greatest weaknesses. Danielle Smith has an incredible strength, and that is she has the ability to walk into a room and make everyone in that room feel heard, acknowledged, seen, and taken seriously. That is an incredible gift as a politician. And it's something that, by the way, that Jason Kenney and a lot of other previous premiers didn't have and suffered for it. She can genuinely go into any room and
feel their pain, Bill Clinton style.
Emote. Yep. And it's a really incredible gift. But in the seeds of that gift also
Doug Ford can do that too.
Yeah. But in the seeds, it's an empathy thing. But in the seeds of that gift also lies the greatest strength, greatest weakness. Because it's one thing to go into a room and feel their pain and make them feel heard. But if you lack the internal discretion, the internal ability in your heart and soul to be like, I feel this person's pain, but that doesn't mean that they're not nuts, you're going to fall off the track and wind up making comments like this every single time. And I think what's really interesting about Danielle Smith, and my husband made this point, I think it's correct, and that is if you put Danielle Smith in a room of the smartest economic geniuses in the world, she is going to sound like the smartest economic genius in the world. And if you put her in a room with people who believe they're making that the chemtrails are making the frogs gay, she is going to seem like the type of person who thinks that the chemtrails are making the frogs gay. Like she's an almost perfect mirror of the people around her, and her ability to be that mirror indicates a high degree of emotional intelligence and by the way, also a high degree of actual intelligence, because she has an ability to synthesize and work through reams of information at a pretty high level. In real time.
Yeah.
Like it's actually a gift. She's smart, but she's smart without discretion or discernment. And that's her biggest weakness. And if she were to try and buttress that weakness by surrounding herself with people who were incredibly like high discretion, best of the best, most talented people in governance in the country, she'd be running the best government in the country.
You trailed off there, Jen. Well, what am I ever to infer from that?
What are you ever to infer from that? Indeed. Instead, what we have is Danielle Smith doing town halls talking about chemtrails.
You know what? Look, I always defer to you on Alberta stuff. You know the people, you know the scene, you know the issues better. But I'm going to make a general comment about this. I don't know if you're right or wrong. I don't have the knowledge base, but what you're saying sounds plausible because I've seen that in other people. But I think a little bit of, we were talking a few minutes ago about the pendulum swing from sort of really extreme positions on the left, right? Where someone can declare that they're a female and then walk into the ladies' room, whip out their penis and pee in the toilet. And this is in the middle of a rape crisis center, or someone my size can go and compete against women in athletic events. And everyone had to just shut up and be okay with that. Something's happened in our politics or our society, and I don't know what it is, but guardrails against batshit crazy stuff have just collapsed.
Yeah.
And we used to basically probably have about 80% of people, maybe 70% thereabouts, living more or less within a fairly mainstream consensus, and you had fringes on left and right. And the righties never want to admit that they have a fringe, and the lefties never want to admit that they have a fringe. And that might have been half the problem in the first place. No one was dealing realistically with the facts on the ground. Mm-hmm. But those guardrails have collapsed. So now you have conservative leaders and progressive or left-leaning leaders, whatever you want to call them, who are actually forced to take seriously stuff that 20 years ago, 50 years ago, we would have looked at and said, what the fuck?
Yeah.
And I don't know what that is. I don't know. I would maybe hazard a guess that social media and the internet have allowed the crazies to organize, to unionize, for lack of a better term. So if you're a politician right now, you're not encountering the crazies one at a time while you're whistle stopping. You're all of a sudden discovering that like there's 10,000 crazies with a mailing list and a fundraising apparatus, and they're all at your next AGM. If I was to make a guess, that would be what's changed. But I miss the era when a guy like Stephen Harper would be like, that's nuts, and blow that guy out the airlock. Doug Ford, to his credit, and I give Doug a tough time because he deserves it. During the pandemic, he was pretty ruthless when people started to go, but what if the vaccines are magnetizing us? That guy was out of the caucus, just done. So there are still some politicians who are prepared to deal with this, others less so. And I don't think this is the fault of the politicians. I don't think they're the ones that collapse the guardrails. Something else happened.
There's consensus.
But some of them are choosing not to deal with it responsibly.
Consensus reality is collapsing.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. And when I say consensus reality, I mean a social consensus reality. I don't mean like,
right, where a critical mass of the population exists in the same information universe, operating off a shared set of assumptions.
There we go. So that consensus reality is just totally collapsing. And that
I do have a column about that coming up because I read that UFO book.
Oh yeah, excellent. Yeah. So anyway, we're gonna get into that because we love UFOs here at the line. Speaking of mainstream shit. And I think that, like Hesed, I don't want to punish the instinct that some politicians like Danielle Smith have to
talk to the marginalized.
To talk to the marginalized and to confront that and to be like, all right, no. And we need to make sure that the growing number of people who are operating outside of the consensus reality that is collapsing, they feel like they are being listened to. They do have a voice. We don't want to necessarily marginalize those people necessarily. You need to be able to make those people feel heard and reassured to some extent. It's just a really hard line to walk between saying, I hear your concern and I feel where you're coming from, and I looked into that and there's nothing here, and accept the possibility that that means that that person will think that you're bought off by the conspiracy. Or it's a fine line to be able to walk, to hear where people are coming from emotionally, but still be willing to assert a truth and be willing to be unliked. And I think that politicians struggle with that. And I think that's a politician like Danielle Smith, who operates from a place of sincere empathy, and I do think she does operate from a place of sincere empathy, is really going to struggle to walk into a room one of these days, and she's going to find herself in a room full of people who are so off the trail in terms of their understanding of the world around them, that even she's going to have to be like, I'm sorry, but that's not real. That's not the reality. And I don't know how she's going to cope with that. It's going to be a hard thing to do, but also I don't envy it. Like it is a hard job. I respect that it's a hard job. I respect that it's a hard line. We here in the journalism space have a bit of an easier time because we're kind of used to people not liking us. I understand perfectly well.
Sure are.
I understand perfectly well that my job is not to be liked. My job is to try and tell people what I believe to be the truth.
Everybody loves us, Jen.
Well, understanding perfectly well that I'm a human with blind spots like everyone else, and I make errors like everyone else, but I'm still going to tell you what I believe to be the truth. This is not a popular position to be in now, because nobody wants to hear the truth all the time. People want to have their emotional biases reinforced. They want to believe they're in on the real truth. They want to believe that the world is out to get them. They want to believe that this and this and this and that, right? And so like the profit is in giving people what they want. The profit is in aligning your product to the incentives. The profit is in, you should be outraged and you should feel this way and you're right to feel this way. The problem is sometimes you're not right to feel that way. Sometimes you're just wrong. You don't have the facts. You don't understand what's going on around you. And me pointing that out doesn't change your mind. It just makes me the enemy. So how do you deal with that? Right? Anyway, so that was a bit of a ramble.
Well, it's a little bit of a political or even sociological scale issue that, like, there are people that we all know in life who are people pleasers. Yeah. And they have a really hard time saying no to people or to requests and to favors. And most people in life, in my experience, are not ruthless or exploitive, but some people are. And those ruthless and exploitive people have a very natural ability to find the people pleasers and just suck them dry.
Yeah.
And as a politician, I'm not aiming this at Danielle Smith because I don't know her well enough.
No, we're talking very, very in a global way here.
Yeah. In a very global sense, if we live in an era where it has become taboo or politically risky or a threat to your fundraising to go, yeah, you know what? You're full of shit. I'm not indulging you. I don't know where that leads us. Andrew Scheer, 2019, head of the last election, he had to be pushed and prodded into denouncing white supremacy, right? And I understood at the time that a lot of conservatives resented the premise of the question. I get it. That they thought to do it was to dignify it. And I understood that strategic calculation. But then Scheer finally did it, and then the issue went away. This is the thing. Like, for any politician who finds themselves dealing with a crazy base of the fringe, you don't need to do no holds barred battle with them repeatedly. Reject them once or twice in public, and you're good. It's hard, but it's not as hard as I think we make it out to be.
Yeah.
So, anyway, the frogs are gay.
And I still have a hard time imagining that the voting base of Albertans who believe in chemtrails is high enough that this could have been
a swing voter between Smith and Nenshi.
Yeah, I don't think that's a swing voter. I don't know. Just if we're going to be Machiavellian about it. Anyway, look, that's kind of my take on everything that's going on for today. We didn't even get into the global stuff. That's fine. There was enough.
The fact that we now have real-time, high-definition footage of volleys of ballistic missiles hitting air bases is something we're going to have to reflect on. But yeah, I'm with you. I got nothing left for this podcast.
All right. Well, thank you very much for sticking with us for a nice long chatter. We hope that you'll come back next week. And if you haven't already, do check us out at www.readtheline.ca. This is where we publish all of our much more thoughtful, much less rambly written content. And more besides. So come to our website and like us and subscribe to us.
Like and subscribe.
Today's podcast was brought to you by Unsmoke Canada. Now is the time to modernize Canadian laws so that adult smokers have information and access to better alternatives. By doing so, we can create lasting change. Learn more at unsmoke.ca.